As you said when we started, not very many people know about the civil grand jury, but they really provide a vital function. They investigate areas where they think that some obligation of the government is not being met. And sometimes they find after that investigation that, in fact, the agency or the department or the government is itself doing what is supposed to be done. And actually, that's a positive thing to learn as well. For other investigations, they identify where there's a weakness, and then the agency or department or the local government has to make a correction. And even though sometimes that's not obvious to people outside of the grand jury, they do their work results in real change in the county.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Only in Santa Clara County, a podcast dedicated to democratizing the process of civic participation in local government. This podcast is produced by the Dreaming Collaborative, a civic nonprofit working at the intersection of culture, technology, and civic life to transform the practice of democracy in local government. My name is Alina Yin, and I will be your host. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our special series on the Santa Clara County Civil Grand Jury. For the next few weeks, we'll be exploring this lesser known facet of our democracy. The Civil Grand Jury consists of 19 citizens who are volunteering from all over Santa Clara County for a 1 year term of public service. As a member of this panel, which is what the Civil Grand Jury 19 members are called, so as a member of this panel, they play a vital role in holding our local government accountable, ensuring that public institutions operate fairly, transparently, and in the best interest of the people they serve. Now, there are 1.9 million people living in Santa Clara County, and of that, we've got around 1,024,000 and some change are registered to vote. And pre pandemic, according to the court, they received an average of 50 applications for the available 19 seats, including the alternates. So, those are backups in case anything happens during the 1 year term. Sometimes people step out for various reasons. And so, 50 applications is very, very low. So it's our hope that this series can help educate people and inform people of this phenomenal opportunity to be in public service. And we are hoping to help the courts diversify the representation both culturally, socioeconomically, and age wise. And so we really, really hope that you enjoy learning about this process and consider applying. It is totally free to apply. Now, before we get to our interview for this episode, we are going to have a brief history lesson. So, the concept of juries is thought to date back as early as the 8th century. By 1215, the jury concept had evolved into a guaranteed expressed in the Magna Carta that no free man would be imprisoned or dispossessed or exiled or in any way destroyed except by the lawful judgment of his peers. In the United States, the Massachusetts Bay Colony impaneled the first grand jury in 1635 to consider cases of murder and robbery, among other crimes. Now, the U.S. Constitution's Fifth Amendment calls for grand juries, and Section 23 of Article 1 of the California Constitution requires that a grand jury be drawn and summoned at least once a year in each county. Grand juries were established throughout California during the early years of statehood. And as constituted today, the grand jury is a part of the judicial branch of government, an arm of the court. And the major function of present day civil grand juries is to be the watchdog of local governments. And considerable effort is devoted to these responsibilities. The civil grand jury may examine all aspects of county and city government and special districts to ensure that the best interests of Santa Clara County residents are being served. The civil grand jury is also authorized to inspect and audit books, records, and financial expenditures to ensure that public funds are properly accounted for and legally spent. They are able to inspect financial records of 27 special districts in Santa Clara County. inquire into the conditions of jails and detention centers, inquire into the changes of willful misconduct in office by public officials or employees. And here to tell us more is the current presiding judge of Santa Clara County, the Honorable Judge Emede. Honorable Judge Emede assumed the role of presiding judge on January 1st, 2025, appointed originally to Santa Clara County Superior Court bench in December 2009. Judge Emede previously served in the Civil Division, the Criminal Domestic Violence Court, Provisional Remedies and Appellate Division, Probate Court, Family Court, and Misdemeanor Court. Judge Emede is also a presenter at various judicial and continual legal education seminars and previously taught community property and family law at Santa Clara University School of Law. Before we get to our episode, if you enjoy our programming from only in San Jose to only in Santa Clara County, please consider giving us a like, a follow, a share. We are a part of the Dreaming Collaborative, a civic nonprofit working at the intersection of culture, technology, and civic life to transform the practice of democracy in local government. And without further ado, on to our interview. Okay. So thank you so much for joining me, Judge Emede. And I would love for you to introduce yourself to listeners.
Thank you. I am Judge Julie Emede. I'm the presiding judge of the Santa Clara County Superior Court. Before I was a judge, I was an attorney for about 14 years in both civil practice, and I was a family law attorney as well. As a judge, I've served in most of our courts, in the criminal court and the civil court, the family court, and probate court. And now I'm serving as our presiding judge.
And what inspired you to get into law?
That's a very good question. Like many people you talk to who are lawyers and judges, I was inspired by watching Perry Mason on television when I was younger. I also participated in a mock trial program where I actually had a chance to um, act as a lawyer in a case in my high school. And I was very interested in that, very much enjoyed that. I didn't go into law school actually right out of college. I spent 7 years working for a large tech company here in Silicon Valley. And then I had an opportunity to leave that company with a severance package, and I decided to go to law school, actually. So I really came back to that interest in law some years after I was out of college.
Oh, I love that. I love that it's non-traditional and that you found your way back to it after the seeds were planted when you were much younger.
And I do think I was a better lawyer and I'm a better judge because of my time spent in industry. Get different kind of training in industry. I have a better, I think, appreciation for the business world, for example, and training about leadership.
Yeah, I can imagine that the time you spent in the corporate world and just with real working experience does feed into your perspective of how the law is applied.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And really quickly, for those who are not familiar, what is a presiding judge?
So the presiding judge is elected by the other judges on the bench. We serve a 2-year term. Our role is largely administrative. So it's really the only role in the court where the judge is not in the courtroom deciding cases most of the time. Our job is to represent the court to the public, to county and other local governments, uh, to represent our court at the statewide level to the Judicial Council and other courts, and really to so the presiding judge also makes decisions about where judges sit for their assignments. So there's a lot of internal administrative things that the presiding judge is responsible for. So there's very much an outward facing role, but there's also an inward facing role, which really is how do we function? Are there better ways for us to function? And working with all of my colleagues to make that decision. We have 82 judicial slots on our court. Currently, only 75 of them are filled. But those judges are the ones that elected me to be the presiding judge for this 2-year term.
Oh, that's really cool. There is other pathways to apply your knowledge outside of the courtroom as well.
Exactly. There are really only two circumstances when I'm working in the courtroom. One is I do select our criminal grand jury, which is not really the subject of our conversation today, but we do have criminal grand jurors, and I do select them. They sit and hear criminal cases. They're jurors that are drawn from the regular jury pool, and I select those 5 or 6 times a year. Then those folks sit for maybe 5 or 6 weeks at a time. And then I also am responsible for the civil grand jury, which is what we're talking about today. And so I do spend a little bit of time in the courtroom with the criminal or with the civil grand jury, but not that much.
Okay. So now kind of going into before we get to the civil grand jury, can you give us like a judicial branch overview and what are some core things that people should know that they probably did not learn in school?
So that is a very big question, of course, but I can give you a very sort of a short answer for that that might be more interesting to your listeners. So the judicial branch's role in our democracy is just as it is for the other two branches, the legislative and executive branch, is to act as a check on the other branches of the government. But also our role is to ensure that all litigants who come into our courts, so criminal defendants, civil litigants, family law participants, any of our courts, have an opportunity to settle their disputes, and where appropriate, the court can hold people accountable, and all of that can be done in a court of law and not out on the streets.
And what is the is there a political aspect or not supposed to be a political aspect when we think about judges?
So interestingly, the judges are prohibited by the Code of Judicial Ethics from expressing any political opinions or opinions on any issue that could come before the court or any court, actually. We understand when we take the role as a judge that we've agreed that our First Amendment rights can be limited, that can't express ourselves in the way that an everyday citizen can express themselves. We accept that limitation as part of the role, but we want to ensure that everyone who comes into court, attorneys, litigants, witnesses, all feel that the court can be fair and impartial. And if we are out there expressing ourselves or taking positions on things, people will think issues are already decided or that the judge can't be fair for some reason. So we recognize that's our role and we willingly accept that as part of our part in democracy.
And in fulfilling that obligation, following the code of judicial ethics, is there an accountability arm for monitoring or keeping judges accountable to that code of ethics?
There is. Judges ourselves, if we know that a colleague has done something that we think would violate the code of judicial ethics, have an obligation to try to do something about that. So that can include talking to a judge. It can include, in very serious cases, a requirement to report a judge to the Commission on Judicial Performance. Other participants in the court system can also report a judge they think has violated the Code of Judicial Ethics to the Commission on Judicial Performance, and that's really our oversight body. One of the roles of the presiding judge is people can also complain. They can send letters to me complaining about a judicial officer, and then I respond to that, and if appropriate, take action with that judicial officer as well.
Oh, I didn't know that. So there is a website, I'm assuming, where people can submit letters and be in contact if they feel something has happened and they want to report it.
Exactly, that's right.
Okay. So now let's move into, the structure. There's, the federal, the state, and then counties and down to the local level. Can you explain that for us?
Sure. So I'm part of the Santa Clara County Superior Court. Federal courts are people are probably very familiar with what's happening in federal courts right now because there's a lot of activity in the federal courts. Federal courts really decide issues that cross over states, for example. So if a large company they're incorporated in one state, they have a manufacturing facility in another state, and they sell into a third state, that would likely any dispute with respect to them would be decided in a federal court because it crosses state lines. Federal courts also review the federal government. So that's why a lot of issues are currently pending there because people are raising issues on all sides that go to the federal courts. In the state, there's a county, there are 58 counties in California, and there's a county court in every one of the 58 counties. And we decide local issues. So most people, most of your listeners probably have had contact, if they've had any court contact, with a county superior court. So they come into court for a lot of reasons: traffic tickets, divorces, um, unlawful detainers, so landlord tenant issues, maybe criminal court, maybe civil court on a larger financial issue. So all of those issues are decided at the county level. If somebody disagrees with an order from the county court, they can appeal that to the 6th District Court of Appeal in our county. There are courts of appeal all over the state, of course. And then if people don't like the answer out of the Court of Appeal, they can apply to the Supreme Court for the Supreme Court to review that. The Supreme Court doesn't have to take up every case that's appealed to them. They make choices about whether they hear the case or not. The Court of Appeal does have to review every case that is brought to them.
So the Supreme Court, do they only review appeal cases?
Yes, and we're talking about the California Supreme Court, by the way.
Mhm. Oh, okay.
If people don't like the outcome of a California Supreme Court case, there are some situations where they can ask the US Supreme Court to review that. So it's sort of another level of review.
Okay. And then the federal Supreme Court, they also only review appeal cases?
Yes, although I will say both in the state court and in the federal court, there are some very limited, very unusual situations where a court can take an issue directly, but it's
Mm,
very limited.
okay. And do justices on the Supreme Court have like a commission of judicial performance as well? Do they have accountability partners?
So I don't I'm not aware in the federal court of a similar organization like the Commission on Judicial Performance. I suspect that there is some ethics body, but I don't know what it is. Uh, the California Supreme Court, I don't know why somebody could not make a report about something about a California Supreme Court justice. I'm not aware that they're exempt in any kind of way.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay. And then last question before we get more local is how does a person become a judge?
There are two main ways by how somebody becomes a state court judge, which is what I am. One way is we're appointed by the governor. So it's a bit of a lengthy process. You submit an application, then you are reviewed. If there's a local bar association, the governor's office will often ask that the local bar association do a review of your qualifications and provide some feedback. There's also the Judicial Nominations Evaluation Committee. So if the governor decides that the governor would like more information about a candidate, they send you to that organization. We just call that Jenny for short, JNE, Jenny. And then they submit information to the governor. There's also um, a local um, group of judges and lawyers, and I think some public members, although I don't know that part for sure, in each county that the governor asks to take an initial look at any applicant. So that group gives some feedback to the governor. Then there's the Jenny Commission gives feedback, and then a local bar association that might give feedback. After all of that has happened, uh, if the governor is interested in knowing whether or not you might be a good candidate, then you're invited to an interview with the Judicial Appointments Secretary. And then after that interview, if you are selected, you receive a call that tells you you're going to be appointed, and then you are appointed. So that's the long process, feels long to me anyway, process to be appointed. Uh, it is also possible there are, and if you are appointed in that way, we do have to sit for election as well after that. So, um, and how long it takes before you have to sit for election depends on a lot of things that would be very uninteresting to people. But it's usually some judges have to sit for election in the next year. Most judges don't sit for election for at least a couple of years. And then if no one runs against you, you don't even go on the ballot. You're considered reelected, and that's good for 6 years. So you sit for reelection every 6 years, basically. Sometimes a judge retires at a time period when um, their seat would go to election. And so then there are judicial elections. So and then whoever's elected, they're exactly the same kind of a judge as every other judge. We're just elected together. They come in a different way, and then they also have to sit for reelection every 6 years, just like the judges who were appointed.
Okay, so at some point in time, whether they are elected or appointed, all judges eventually go through an election process unless nobody is running against them for several years.
That's correct, and in our county anyway, and in most counties, uh, it is most common for the judge not to have anybody who opposes them and not have to run in an active election.
Hmm.
But but it does happen, and it's happened in this county.
Hmm. I do remember it being on my ballot at least once in the last couple years. And is there requirements to becoming a judge? Have you had, have to practice law for a certain number of years to even be qualified, or is there not?
There is. You have to have been a lawyer for at least 10 years before you can apply or run as a judge.
Okay. Okay. All right. Now on to the Superior Court of Santa Clara County. I'm wondering if you can tell us about what the relationship is like with the county of Santa Clara and then the court system of the county.
We are very fortunate in Santa Clara County. We have a very good relationship with the county. It's very separate, so I do wanna be clear about that. I mean, we judges are staying in our lane, and the county very much respects that and stays in their lane. But there are a lot of areas where we do collaborate. So there are a lot of parts of our court system. So, for example, behavioral health is very involved in our criminal courts, and behavioral health is a county agency. So we do coordinate with them about how behavioral health, for example, will be used. Um, there are other similar agencies like that where we have crossover, and so we collaborate a lot. Uh, this county um, is, I think, very committed to making sure that its citizens have access to justice and a lot of the other issues that are in the forefront for them. But because of that, are involved in meetings with them, and we do communicate regularly about things that do cross over between the court and the county.
Okay. I didn't realize that relationship with behavioral health, which is really interesting considering that that I feel very supported and a sense of commitment from the county of Santa Clara when it comes to behavioral health and, for example, like with the unhoused situation. And so I've always seen a lot from that end.
Well, and for example, the sheriff's office is a county office, and the court contracts with the sheriff's office to provide security at the courthouse. And so we have deputies in our courtrooms and deputies at the entrances to our courthouses. So that's another area where there's sort of a crossover, but it's contractual.
Hmm.
So there are a lot of those kinds of crossovers with the county.
Okay. All right. So now on to the civil grand jury. And when I speak to most people, they have no idea that this exists. They're very familiar with jury duty. They're very familiar with jury duty, and people definitely have feelings about jury duty, but not a lot of folks actually know about the civil grand jury. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So the civil grand jury, I should start by saying the civil grand jury is made up of people who volunteer to be on the civil grand jury. It's not part of the regular jury selection process. Nobody gets an envelope in the or a postcard in the mail that tells them to appear on a given day to be selected for the civil grand jury. So it's a volunteer role in the judicial system. Actually, the civil grand jury is part of the judiciary. Uh, the role of the civil grand jury is to examine and investigate. Their objective is to detect and disclose flaws in county government or other local governments. So they're supposed to investigate whether monies are being handled properly, whether or not they inspect county detention facilities, for example. And really, the grand jurors take complaints from citizens about government and determine which issues they're going to follow up on. That is within the grand jury's purview to decide what they will work on or not. And then they do investigation. and then they prepare reports at the end of their investigation. County agencies and governments are required to respond to those reports. So, really, their goal is to guarantee that governments in our county are honest and efficient and that they're serving in the best interest of the people. That sounds very lofty, but that actually is their obligation. And we talk a lot about that when people are selected, and that is the charge that they're given when they begin their work.
And for a civil grand juror, they can only decide what they're going to investigate from the complaints that they receive, or do they have autonomy to go outside of that complaint box?
They don't have to only take on the complaints that are brought to them. So a grand juror may say, um, there's some issue that's percolating in the community. Is this an issue that we as the grand jury would like to take on? We are very careful when we are interviewing potential grand jurors to talk about how important it is for somebody not to come on to the grand jury because they're interested in a particular issue. That's not how the grand jury works. We don't want people on the grand jury who have something that they're invested in some kind of way. As a matter of fact, if somebody's on the grand jury and they have a personal connection to an issue, they might be, um, they might have to disqualify themselves from that investigation anyway. So, but it can be whatever's just percolating in the county at the time, and the grand jury can choose to take that up as a group. But they choose as a group what they're going to take up.
Wow, that's so cool. Another question I had was for in terms of local government bodies that they are able to investigate, does that include like cities, counties, and special districts, or is there a limitation?
It does include special districts as well. So city, county, special districts, all of those. And I should point out one other thing while we're having this part of the conversation. Even though the civil grand jury is part of the judicial branch, they the court does not direct their work. The court, I don't limit their work in any way unless they're acting outside of their legal role. So unless they're if they're as long as they're acting within their legal role. For example, I review the reports at the end of the year to be sure that they are within their legal role. But if they are, regardless of whether I agree or disagree with the report, which quite frankly is not something I've really run into, but and I don't have an opinion about the reports that they've issued, then the reports are issued. So even though they're statutorily under the judicial branch, the court does not, as I said, direct their work. So they are once they are selected, they're very independent in terms of what they choose to work on, and then the reports that come out of that work.
Oh, and what kind of resources do the civil grand jury have when they're investigating?
So um, the civil grand jurors are, as I said before, volunteers. They choose to participate on the civil grand jury. They do have legal resources. Our county council does provide a lawyer that provides advice to them. The court has a grand jury coordinator that works with them directly. She has other roles at the court as well, but she does provide a lot of assistance to the grand jury to make sure that they have um, technological resources they might need, a place where they meet together, uh, technological support in terms of if somebody can't make a program work, that kind of thing. A lot of that is funded by the county, by the way, and that's statutory that the county funds it. But we provide that assistance and really the coordination for that. And then the legal assistant comes from county council.
Okay. And
I should
do
add
the
one other thing.
Mhm.
They can also request that a subpoena be issued.
Mhm.
So sometimes they do request that a subpoena be issued. The court does then take care of getting that subpoena issued.
Okay. And how is so people would apply, and I'm assuming it's pretty like 18 and over, they're registered or they can be registered, or do they have to be registered to vote?
There are a number of things. No, they do not have to be registered to vote. They do have to be a US citizen. So it's primarily, are they a resident of the county and nothing that prohibits them from participating?
And do all 58 counties in California have a civil grand jury?
They do.
And in other states, is it similar?
I don't know about other states. I do know
Mhm.
because, again, it's statutory. The size of
Mm,
civil grand jury can vary depending on the size of the county.
mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So, what do you feel in terms of who should join and the type of person who might enjoy this type of work, or if they have certain talents and skills that would be amenable to serving as a grand juror?
I am always impressed with the people that volunteer to be on the grand jury. Um, the most important thing I think is that somebody has to be interested in public service. As I said, it's a volunteer service. People spend at least 20 hours a week for a year on the civil grand jury. And so it really is public service to our county. Uh, People have to want to participate in our democracy. Really, this is a government oversight function. And so people have to be interested in that. They have to be interested in learning new things. They have to be interested in collaborating with other people. Because of the time commitment, that 20 hours a week, they really have to be available for that. Uh, so, for example, it would be hard for somebody who had a demanding full-time job to serve on the civil grand jury because the civil grand jury usually meets during, what would be considered regular working hours, that kind of thing. So it has to be somebody who is available outside of that kind of work. We do have people that work, so it's not. Then there's no limitation. I mean, if you work and want to also give 20 hours a week to the grand jury, that's fantastic. But as a practical matter, sometimes that doesn't work very well. We're always looking for folks who like to write, for example, because these reports do have to be written. Um, People should like to interview other people, so they should be curious about people, not mind meeting with people they don't know, and being able to ask sometimes difficult questions, and review documents. And sometimes, you know, there are people who like numbers. They might have a chance to review an accounting, that kind of thing. Um, so, and as I said before, and this is an important thing, is they have to want to collaborate with others. The reports are usually written collaboratively. There does have to be some level of technological ability, because that collaboration usually happens on documents that are shared. Very often now the grand jury meets remotely, so you have to sort of have enough technological capability to be able to, get on a remote session and understand how all of that stuff works. Um, but really, it's just people who are interested in learning more about the county and about government and wanting to work with other people that are doing those kinds of things.
So how do they actually make decisions? Do they have to do like a majority vote, or how does that work?
They do have to vote. 12 of the 19 have to agree on the outcome. So they do vote together. Um, there's a They set up their own structure in terms of who's on what committees and how all of that works. The court does appoint the presiding grand juror, but after that, they select their other leaders and then they determine the committees that each of them are on. And then those committees work on a report, for example, on one particular issue. Then they bring it back to the grand jury as a whole, and then the grand jury as a whole votes on that.
Would you say if somebody was interested in going into law or running for office one day, is this a good kind of like testing ground to see if you really want to do that work?
That's a good question. We have definitely had applicants and I think some members of the grand jury who have been interested in the law or interested in government. Again, if it is a very significant commitment. So if somebody can do that, I think it's interesting. It is not very much like practicing law. It's probably would be more interesting to somebody who was interested in being in government because they could see how investigations are done about government and what's important to a grand jury. They could see that. We have had we have definitely had some grand jurors who have worked in government, who have, after they've retired, come and participated on the grand jury. And so that's always valuable to have people who really understand government serving on the grand jury, but that's more common than the other way around.
Mm. So if you are a current employee of a government agency, you would not be able to be on the jury?
You could be on the grand jury, but the likelihood that you would have something that would disqualify you would be very high. So, for example, if somebody was working for the city of San Jose, they would be ineligible for so many investigations that it might not be a very good fit for them.
Got it. Got it. Okay. And now wrapping up, why do you think serving on the grand jury and this facet of our democracy is important?
Thank you for asking that question. As you said when we started, not very many people know about the civil grand jury, but they really provide a vital function. They investigate areas where they think that some obligation of the government is not being met. And sometimes they find after that investigation that, in fact, the agency or the department or the government is itself doing what is supposed to be done. And actually, that's a positive thing to learn as well. For other investigations, they identify where there's a weakness, and then the agency or department or the local government has to make a correction. And even though sometimes that's not obvious to people outside of the grand jury, they do their work results in real change in the county. So most grand jurors would tell you, and I hope that you'll hear this from the folks that you're going to interview, that it's very interesting work, that they feel like it's impactful. They felt that they really participated in how our government works by having a chance to investigate and then provide some feedback. There are some grand jury reports over the last 4 or 5 years that have been quite public and covered in the media, and that people had a lot of information about. The vast majority are not quite so public, but are also, I think, very impactful. So I think that it's really important to the way that our government works to make sure that there's accountability. Agencies, departments, governments know that there's a grand jury, so they know that they might be reviewed, and so that provides also its kind of own incentive for people and those agencies really to make sure that they're handling the people's business the way that they should. On the court's website, if you go to our court's website, you can search on the website for civil grand jury. You can go to this grand jury landing page, and the reports are there. You can read the reports, you can read the county responses, and you can read um, in those county responses what action, whoever it is, the agency or department or government, what action they took in response to the report. So you can actually see what that impact is.
Okay. So then the county or whatever the report is addressing in other government bodies, they do respond.
They do respond. They're required to respond. They do respond. And sometimes we'll get a response. We'll get one response, and then a short time later, we'll get a secondary response when they'll say, in the first response, they might say, "We're looking at that issue, we'll respond further." There'll be a secondary response. Sometimes a grand jury will review old reports and see whether or not the grand jury got what it thought was a satisfactory response. And if not, they'll issue a new report and request that the agency or department or government respond further, and they do. Um, it's I think it's very interesting that agencies take these reports very seriously and they do respond to them.
And so most of these reports have to come to some sort of conclusion. They can't be left open, even if there's like maybe the government agency is appealing. I don't know if there's an appeals process for for the report.
There's not an appeals process, but they can say, "We don't agree with the finding of the grand jury, and here's why we don't agree, and we're not going to take any action." So they can just say that. Um, the grand jury term is 1 year, so it's July 1st to June 30th of every year. Sometimes the grand jury is in the middle of an investigation at the end of the year, and they don't have time to finish their report. So there are some situations where an issue might cross over into a second grand jury. The second grand jury has to decide whether they want to take that issue on or not. But if they do, in terms of issues that kind of continue from one grand jury to the next, there are some of those situations, but they're not very frequent.
Okay. Is there a term limit to how many times a person can be on the civil grand jury?
We do take into consideration there are benefits of having people who've been on the grand jury continue on a grand jury because it gives continuity. But also, we want to make sure that citizens who want to participate in the grand jury have the opportunity to do so. And quite frankly, since it is such a large time commitment, some people are very happy to do it once, but unable to commit that kind of time, 2 or 3 years. But we have had some grand jurors that have been on a few years, had grand jurors do it for a year, go away for a few years, come back and seek to do it again. So uh, there are some people who enjoy the work enough that they come back.
Okay. All right. We had talked about it yesterday, but it was, I don't know, I forgot my question. I wish I wrote it down, but it was kind of what are your thoughts in terms of politics and the law today? And I feel like, we seem to be in a moment where judges have issued orders and those orders are not being followed. And what does that mean for our judicial branch in this moment?
That's a very complicated question. And again, I think you're talking largely about federal court orders, so the state courts are not subject to as much of that.
Hmm.
It is central to our democracy that people follow the rule of law. So it's central that judges hold themselves to a standard that they are following the rule of law. It is um, a powerful thing that in cases, if an order is issued, most people will follow that order. That's a powerful thing, and it's part of our social contract. Uh, I don't have an opinion about whether people are following or not following court orders. That really is not something that I'm uh, able to talk about because that would be outside of the scope of my role as a judicial officer. But it is really central to our democracy for people to um, voluntarily, voluntarily and involuntarily participate in the court system and to follow the orders that are made in the court system. That is part of our social contract.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. And that's it. So thank you so much for this conversation and for sitting with me and going through this process. I think the way that you explained it was very easy to understand, and I'm really excited to get this episode out there.
Well, I hope that your listeners think it's interesting. It's such an esoteric thing, and I think, as you learn more about it, I think it's super interesting, but I didn't know what it was. I could have 5 years ago, I couldn't have explained any of it to you, so well, if you need anything else, please feel free to reach out to me.
All right, everybody. And that is a wrap for this episode. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like, give it a share, give us a follow. Tune in to the next episode. We will be talking about how the civil grand jury works and taking a deep dive into the details. And if you enjoy programming and want to continue supporting this type of programming, consider making a tax deductible donation to the Dreaming Collaborative. You can find our donation links in our show notes. And until next time.